Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Landmark, your go-to podcast for navigating the complexities of the property and development industry. I'm your host, James Bailey, managing partner here at Bruton Knowles, and today, along with most of the UK it seems, we're breaking down the 2024 autumn budget with specific focus on what it means for us as a business, for our clients and for the sectors in which we operate in. So, this budget comes at a pivotal time for the UK economy, with a pressing need for stability and strategic investment. The Chancellor outlined ambitious spending plans and tax adjustments, all geared towards supporting key sectors like housing, infrastructure and energy, including a stronger push towards renewable energy. But while there's an opportunity in these announcements, there's also a fair share of challenges, especially with tax increases and the impact on business costs. Joining me to help dig into the details are Bruton Knowles colleagues and shareholders, Nigel Billingsley, Ian Pitt and Guy Emmerson, all ready to share their insights and opinions.
Hi, I'm Nigel Billingsley, partner at Bruton Knowles and head of the Utility and Infrastructure faculty.
Hi, I'm Ian Pitt, partner at Bruton Knowles and head of the Valuation faculty.
And I'm Guy Emmerson, partner and head of the Development and Planning faculty.
Let's start with some context. The lead up and the headlines. Billed as an historic budget, Labour's first since 2010. First ever from a woman Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. The biggest tax rise in budget since 1993, raising taxes overall by £40 billion. Much leaked, much anticipated and much feared. As a quick overview, better or worse than expected, everyone?
Well, I think the issue that we've got here is that there have been a substantial number of leaks over the past few weeks and months. And I think that from the start of the new government, when they expressed a massive concern about the alleged £20 billion black hole, we'd been prepared for a really bad budget. I think when it's come out, there are certain areas that are better than expected and certain areas that are worse. So I would thought on balance, probably about what's expected.
Ian, what's your thought?
Well, the headlines seem to be about national insurance, although there are other taxes that businesses pay which represent a percentage of the overall tax burden, and these seem to be hidden in the detail of that budget.
Okay, Guy?
I think for me, the fact that capital gains tax didn't rise as much as was, I was going to say predicted, but maybe it was scaremongering. I guess that's good overall. We're just hoping that it's not going to disincentivise landowners from bringing land forward for development, but time will tell. I think the fact that there's no change to inheritance tax as a general point is welcome, but I think we're going to hear for a long time yet the implications on the agricultural relief. I think that's going to have a big impact.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's something we'll touch upon later on in the podcast and probably in subsequent ones as well. I think for us, probably the natural starting point is to pick up on the business and capital investment around tax incentives. Key one, and the one that's raising an awful lot of money in this particular budget, is the employer's contribution to national insurance. So just as a synopsis, it's currently 13.8%, rising to 15% from April 2025, and the threshold being reduced from 9,300 to 5,000. So clearly an exercise in raising an awful lot of revenue for the Exchequer, but it's another cost on business, which they're going to have to take on the chin. Nigel, what's your general view in terms of us as a business coping with that sort of imposition?
Well, I think at Bruton Knowles we're robust enough to be able to cope with that. But I think as a general point, there's a naivety to think that business will simply absorb that. And I think it'll be seen as a reason to really scrutinise people that work in small businesses, particularly SMEs, and try to understand whether they're actually contributing. And at one level, it is a tax on jobs. I think the sneaky element of it, and I think sneaky is the word, is the reduction of the limit at which you start to pay that tax. And dropping it down to £5,000 is really a very small amount of money given the minimum wage. And so effectively the use of part-time people, I think, could become something that we don't see. And that's an area of activity that I think is helpful for lots of people that are carers, etc. So I'm not sure it quite fits in with the government's overall policies. I think there's also a naivety to think that this cost will not be spread around in terms of future salary increases, bonuses, etc. amongst staff. So it's, although on the face of it, it's a tax on employers, in reality, in the modern world, employers and employees tend to have to work together to deliver for their businesses, to keep their businesses working. So I think that there will be a wider set of impacts. And of course, it's a tax on jobs. And at the minute, the job market's quite hot, but it could soon cool down, and we'll see how that works in the future.
Yeah, and I think it's that cumulative point, isn't it, that it's coming at a time where businesses are already struggling with increased costs of delivery of services or goods, and it's just unhelpful for many businesses. I don't think it's going to be great for cash flow for anyone, and people are going to have to start looking on ways in which they can absorb it in an efficient way. You've either got to look at your cost base, or you've got to look at increasing the price of your services and goods.
We've had a period of over 4 years where businesses have struggled to keep costs down in a very difficult economic climate, and it's just made it even worse for these businesses who have to make further cost savings. It's going to impact a lot of businesses as a result.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the landscape for the last 4 years has been extremely challenging, what with COVID and Brexit and the general cost of delivering services, because the cost of living is so high and increasing. That overall economic landscape for all businesses is, well, it is really, really challenging. So I think it's a polite way of saying it's unhelpful. I think it's making things, really, really difficult for businesses. I agree with Nigel. I think you can't just absorb these sorts of financial hits. You have to look at your business from a very strategic point of view in terms of what are we doing and how are we doing it. Now, we've worked really hard to sort of drive efficiencies through the business in the last 3 years, particularly invested very heavily in IT infrastructure, which all helps to make us competitive. But the problem is it costs money, as we know, IT is something that you need to substantially invest in year on and year out. So anything that erodes your ability to reinvest in your business, it's quite a concern, I think, for us all, really, as business owners. But, we just have to take it on the chin and work out, like everyone else does, how are we going to absorb it and make ourselves a more efficient business. But difficult, I think. So another area that the Exchequer looks at is business rates. Ian, this is your bag, definitely. So I think the rest of us will just be silent and listen for a moment. But in terms of what's happened with business rates in this autumn budget?
Okay, thanks, James. But business rates make up 5% of UK tax. Small business multiplier has been frozen for the 5th year in a row. This applies to occupied premises with a rateable value of 51,000 and below. Standard multiplier will increase in line with September's CPI from 54.6 pence to 55.5 pence. Interestingly, as expected, most private schools will, from April next year, see the removal of charitable relief, which will result in some bills increasing by 5 times. However, private schools which are wholly or mainly concerned with private full-time education to pupils with an education, health and care plan will remain eligible for relief. We've all heard about the rate relief on properties in the retail, hospitality and leisure sector, and that will continue for another year, but will be reduced from 75% to 40% and subject to the same cap of £110,000 per business. The budget coincided with the publication of a discussion paper focused on transforming business rates, which indicates there will be shortly a further consideration around empty rates avoidance, which has been a hot topic for a number of years. Looking ahead, there'll be permanently lower tax rate for retail, hospitality and leisure properties from April 2026. The indication is that this will be fiscally neutral, so the lower multiplier will be funded by a corresponding higher multiplier from the same year for properties with a rateable value at or above £500,000. So one's paying for the other one's relief.
Yeah, sounds like it. Moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic a bit, isn't it?
But when you consider for the hospitality sector in particular, less business tax relief, higher minimum wages, national insurance increases, supply cost increases, it doesn't paint a pretty picture for the future.
No, and I think the issue with hospitality and leisure particularly is it's all about disposable income, isn't it? So, if there's less of that within the economy, it's really difficult for these operators to continue driving margin and sustain their business. So, yeah, again, challenging.
It is the smaller businesses that will continue to benefit from the freeze to the smaller multiplier, though the rateable value above 51,000 will bear the brunt of the inflationary increase.
Yeah, just because something hasn't gone up doesn't mean it's a good thing.
No, because I think in the context of everything's going up and gone up, isn't it? So it's little relief, isn't it? I'm afraid in terms of that. But I mean, business rates is something that has annually just come up for discussion, isn't it? And the reforms have been much talked about but never delivered
For many, many years. Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, do you think they're actually going to do something about it this time, or kick the can down the road again?
Well, following the election of the Labour Party, there was widespread anticipation of significant change to business rate regime. However, this large-scale reform's been missing from the Chancellor's first budget.
Yeah, which is quite telling, isn't it?
It is.
And as we know, business rates is something that government likes because it's a tax that's paid.
Absolutely.
So,
it still represents an income to the government.
So you could argue if it isn't broken, why does it need fixing?
Correct.
So, yeah, we shall have to wait and see on that one. So moving on, I mean, obviously outside of the individual taxes relating to businesses, there was discussions around infrastructure and regional development. So the Chancellor has committed additional funds for housing investment, for school building and for road maintenance, which I think she specifically referred to potholes, with £500 million. But I think it'd be quite interesting for us as a business. Obviously, we are heavily involved in infrastructure projects in the UK. Nigel, what's your take on the commitment to infrastructure and regional development?
I think in terms of infrastructure development, clearly there are major projects like East West Rail and the Transpennine route, and we work on both of those, so it's pleasing to see that they're going to be continued and progressed with. But I think there is a recosting, and I noticed that the overall budget for Department of Transport was going down. So I think it wasn't really a budget for infrastructure. I think, however, people are talking about that. But there'll also be, I think, a 10-year infrastructure plan coming out in the near future.
Right.
And I think it's part of one of the things about this budget, actually, is it sits in the centre of a whole range of other occurrences that the government are looking at, other reports. And that includes things like the infrastructure plan and also the workers' rights bill and all those various things that will all come together as part of a picture around the budget. But I think the infrastructure plan is difficult because the cost of infrastructure is huge. It's gone up by leaps and bounds since COVID. There aren't particularly enough people to deliver the build of infrastructure, even if it gets consented. There aren't particularly enough people to deliver the consents that are required. And we see that with the sort of funding that the government have looked at for, say, Great British Energy, which itself is probably around 20% of the amount that National Grid went to the markets to get. And a lot of our infrastructure is being funded from overseas. But it's very difficult to see this budget's particularly helpful for infrastructure. I think it's been passed down the line, and I suspect that traditionally infrastructure, particularly road building, is something that governments can stop reasonably quickly and avoid that spend. And we saw that previously with the HS2 ending from the Birmingham North section. Yeah,
I think historically there's always been with road schemes, they're in and they're out depending on which government, which is again a criticism of the UK, that long-term sustainable planning around infrastructure it just hasn't been in place, and it looks like it isn't at the moment. However, I think to be fair to Rachel Reeves, what she has said is that what they're looking to do is to actually cost schemes and put them into the Treasury budget in a much more structured way than has previously been done. But we'll have to wait and see in future budgets and what that 10-year plan tells us.
I think a good example of the lack of long-term thinking is the second Thames crossing. And quite clearly our links to Europe are really important. And anybody who's been down to Kent or down to the south coast will realise that it's never easy to get across the Thames on the bridge or coming back in the tunnel. No. And to have a second crossing, I think, would be a really positive strategic development for the UK. I think the cost at the minute is around 9 billion. Obviously, that's not cheap, but in the context of what that might do for UK PLC, I think it would probably be money well spent. Hopefully, something like that will be able to be funded.
Yeah, I agree. So, Guy, housing and infrastructure spending.
Well, I get quite excited about the government's approach to housing delivery. I think they are putting forward a lot of good stuff, which, they've got to, because they've got to up the housing number delivery a long way. The £5 billion sounds like an enormous amount of money, but I think most of that is made up for affordable housing funding.
Right.
And let's be honest, it needs to, because at the moment stock is in poor condition. housing development schemes are being stalled because housing associations aren't putting the money into new schemes. So a lot of it does go in there. I think there's going to be another announcement next year around the affordable housing programmes, the spending review, and it's hoped that a lot more money will come forward to really push that on the affordable housing point.
The current affordable housing budget runs until 2026, and they've boosted that by 500 million.
That's right, which sounds a lot, but I don't think it's an enormous amount.
No.
What it is, it's around giving them certainty. It's the next 5-year plan that is needed, the next funding round that is needed. I think that there's another 3 billion announced for the housing guarantee scheme, which is, again, useful if you're going to deliver the numbers that they want delivered. That is a scheme that provides access to cheaper funding for SME developers, particularly built to rent. So that is going to be good news. I think if we also go back to the affordable housing point, they've announced, or at least they've confirmed, that the social housing rate settlement for rent increases for the next 5 years is going to be CPI plus 1%. That's good in as far as it provides more certainty and stability for the housing associations. I quite like the idea of the New Homes Accelerator that they have mentioned. It's got promise. It was announced, I think, back in July, where they are focusing on 200 sites with the potential to deliver 3,000 homes, I understand, which have, for one reason or another, stalled. And so Homes England, Ministry of Housing, are going to work with partners to accelerate delivery where that has been delayed by planning or red tape or some local issue. I think there's already been some action on 4 sites, so that's really good. And, we'll be looking to see quite how that unlocks some more housing numbers. I don't know the detail yet, but there was an announcement about £25 million going into a new joint venture to deliver, again, another 3,000 homes, but with a focus on energy efficiency and an aspiration that they're all going to be affordable. Sounds good, but 25 million, when you're talking at that scale, isn't going to go terribly far.
No, it's not an awful lot, is it?
No.
I suppose the reality is there is some good stuff in there. The acid test is it going to significantly increase the housing numbers that are being delivered, given the shortages? And also, what is the impact, what does it mean for the private sector and investment opportunities?
There's a surcharge on stamp duty for second homes purchased in England and Northern Ireland, which is going from 3% to 5%.
Which everyone just assumes is somebody with a second home.
Correct.
Not actual property investors that are running a business that has residential properties that they let out for investment.
Correct.
I think that's another element, isn't it, that I think the theme of this is that you've got to see the budget in the context of other things that are occurring from the government's policies. So if you look at the Renters Act and then add that, which will give more power to renters, and then add in the fact that you'll now be looking at 5% stamp duty if you purchase a house for let, then it makes the whole prospect of private buy-to-let less and less attractive.
Yeah, particularly with capital gains tax at the other end of it. So the exit is more painful.
Absolutely, Guy. And I think the problem, therefore, is who's going to pick up the purchase of houses that perhaps aren't in the greatest condition. Because I recall, going back over 20 years now, there was a housing market collapse in certain areas, places in the north of England, Hull, Oldham, Rochdale, places like that, where property was being sold for £5,000 per unit, even less in some places. And those properties were in really poor condition. So the government introduced a housing renewal. But by the time the housing renewal programme started, many of those properties had been bought for buy-to-let. Many had been improved and they were providing places for people to live by a private buy-to-let. But the problem was that if those people withdraw from that market and they don't come into that market again, then what happens to those properties at the bottom end? If public sector can't purchase them, then maybe we'll look at housing market collapse again. Perhaps that's a little bit of a concern, but certainly many people are leaving that sector at the minute.
That's always been the test, isn't it, for government? That if government leaves gaps in sectors, then it's the private sector that fills those gaps. And I think housing has been the classic example in terms of rented private housing, where it has filled that gap. So we stopped building council houses an awful long time ago, and then we've got housing associations, but there's just been a constant shortfall of affordable housing for rent. So it'll be interesting to see, and I think anecdotally, there is a withdrawal starting from that sector by landlords, by buy-to-let houses have been put up on the market for sale. So,
and that might, I suppose, be why the government is really trying to focus on social housing for rent, so social rent housing as opposed to other forms of tenure like shared ownership. And of course, the First Homes programme seems to be disappearing over the hill. So that might be why they're trying to really focus on that.
I think another interesting thing about housing is that under compulsory purchase rules, those have recently changed. So that if a local authority or an acquiring authority, which could be a government body, seeks to make a compulsory purchase under the Housing Act or for NHS or education purposes, then they're able to include within the order a right to not pay hope value for the land. Because there's a suspicion at the moment that certain areas of land that would be suitable for housing are being land banked by developers that could be brought to the market quicker. And the problem at the moment is that historically, if the local authorities had sought to purchase that land, they'd be paying full market value at residential values, which is hundreds of thousands an acre wherever you are in the country and even more in certain parts. Whereas under the new rules, if they install this element in the compulsory purchase order, they'll just pay existing use value. So there's the opportunity under the changes in the CPO rules for local authorities to acquire residential value land at actually existing use, which is probably agricultural. So it'd be interesting to see if authorities seek to use that power.
Yeah, I don't know that it's right that developers are land banking land. I think that's been sort of proven by the review. But, I agree with much of what you're saying. But the prospect of land that is suitable for residential development being bought at agricultural land value by a local authority who will then do what with it? Probably sell it on at an enormous profit is going to be one of the biggest outrages ever. I could just see, particularly the well-organised, well-funded major landowners trying to resist every single CPO opportunity that there is.
I think that's right, Guy. I think that's right. I think the interesting point is that that's not something we can lay at Labour's door because that was brought in under the previous government. But I think, and I also agree that I don't think that lots and lots of companies have got lots of land ready to go for development that aren't being developed. But I do think it's an interesting concept that local authorities will be able to purchase land at a much lower level and increase the value of that land.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see how that plays out, won't we?
I think when we look at how the infrastructure element of the budget has been packaged, I think what we see there is lots of small amounts of money in the context of how much we need to spend nationally. So we've got some regional funding supporting some of the local mayors. There's a school building programme of, I think that's about 6.7 billion. But if we think about how many schools there are and the amount of work that needs to be done, and also apply that to the fact that the cost of doing anything in terms of construction has rocketed by probably a third over the last few years, then actually 6.7 billion is not a huge amount in terms of reflection, the amount of schools we've got in the country.
Well, catch with that, there's 1.5 billion earmarked for rebuilding over 500 schools.
And that's right, and you think about how much per school that would be.
Correct.
So there's not a huge amount really there to do that. But of course, they will have impact on a certain number of schools and people will see that impact on their local schools. And I think that's part of what the budget's around, is to show that local impact. I think, again, 500 million for road maintenance, and I think that's the thorny issue of potholes. That is obviously something that comes on the front page of newspapers quite a lot. So, but again, 500 million, if you look at that in terms of how many local authorities we've got and what will that achieve. But hopefully it'll achieve quite a lot and it'll be something people can see.
Yeah, although it feels like £500 million will probably go in resurfacing the roads from my house to work, let alone, across the whole country. It doesn't seem like a lot of money.
I'm sure the issue with potholes is they don't actually repair them properly. No. I mean, the whole point about a repair is you would imagine someone turns up and pothole, we know what it is, it's normally sort of a circular thing, isn't it? It's a couple of feet wide, cut a nice square, replace it, seal it so the water can't get in and then the frost cracks it. I have to say, in Nottinghamshire, we don't do it like that. We like to turn up with a bit of a wagon. We chuck some cold tarmac on there. We damp it down, retaining the shape of the pothole, which is clearly quite important, so it stays circular. And then we depart. And the reality is behind that as a repair, it isn't a repair. In terms of the lifespan of that, I think that's the frustration that people see. It's kind of constant patching as opposed to actually repairing things. Because when they say there's 500 million to repair potholes, well, you're not actually repairing them.
And they're spending, as we say, 6.7 billion on education. Defence spending is increasing by 2.9 billion. And then there's also investment in the NHS, where an extra 22.6 billion and a 3.1 billion for investment.
In terms of the NHS investment, a lot of that's day-to-day funding, isn't it?
Correct.
And I think that's the concern, and I think when you look at the budget overall, the 40 billion that's being taken from the budget, a lot of it's going on day-to-day expenses, and then the rest of it's being spread around quite thinly, and I think that's the concern. So are we getting the bang for our buck, if you like? There isn't really a huge outcome for this. There'll be lots of small outcomes that we've just discussed, and there'll be a lot of day-to-day cost for something like the NHS. Whether it has a real impact in the long run is difficult to see.
Yeah, and I think the position is taxes when they go up, they don't come down so quickly, do they? No. So is this a sort of medium to long-term outlook for the UK where we are increasingly significantly taxed, which is up for debate in terms of whether that's right or wrong, but is that going to be matched by world-leading first-class services that we all experience? We can all think of the Scandinavian countries where they do pay an awful lot of income tax, but services are significantly better than in the UK. So is that tangible, your day-to-day experience of what you feel around, going to a doctor, seeing a dentist, driving along roads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a real challenge for this government because hiking taxes up as high as they have, you have to have the experience that goes alongside that, which is you're in a country that is being better run with better services, and it looks and feels like it is. But
you want to know that the pain you've been through has been worth it.
Absolutely.
40,000 extra doctor's appointments, I think I'd heard. But again, that sounds like a big number, but
there's a lot of people to cover.
For a lot of people that go to the doctor.
Correct.
I suppose the answer would be from government that this is only their first budget and it's about the sort of the following budgets as well. But as a starter for 10, it's a bit of a blow.
You look at the fact that they're taking 40 billion in tax, but there's the government spending, when you add the NHS and you add education and defence, there's another 11.8 billion for victims of the infected blood scandal and 1.8 billion for the post office postmasters. Doesn't seem to make a lot of mathematical sense.
No, I suppose she started her statement with saying that they're going to seek to appoint people, specialists, to recover the money that was, how can I put it politely, disappeared during COVID in payments to people, correct, which is an eye-watering amount of money. I think many people would say perhaps you should be focusing on that more than putting everyone else's taxes up across a range of things that impact people. But we'll have to wait and see. I think, they've got to appoint the people and get the department up and running. But people would certainly want to see a lot of that money recovered and certainly want to see some people disappear to prison, I suspect. We undertake an awful lot of rural work. We've got a big rural client base. And I think the standout from the budget in respect of that was the agricultural property relief and business property reliefs, which, just looking at social media last night, seems to have lit it up, basically, in terms of the response from the farming community. I think some of that is based on two things. One, they weren't expecting it. I think there'd been, from discussions they'd had with government, they were led to believe it wasn't going to be as it transpired, which is one thing, but also the impact on small farms and farming families. Guy, what's your thoughts on that?
I've got sympathy with farmers, if I'm honest, on this, but then in my mind, I know what the government is trying to do. They're trying to get the big, wealthy landed estates who are able to pass them through the generations paying no tax. They're trying to capture some of that. But of course, it also captures some people who are really, really struggling to make a living running farms. It really puts in jeopardy the whole hundreds and thousands of years old concept of passing farming down through the family to continue it. Pretty much every farm of any size is going to be over £1 million by the time you put in the houses and everything.
Guy, just for context here, for those that are listening, from April 2026, the first £1 million of combined business and agricultural assets will continue to attract no inheritance tax at all. But for assets in excess of £1 million, inheritance tax will apply at 50% relief at an effective rate of 20%.
And so when you think that that's going to affect a lot of farms, a lot of farming businesses. When father farmer dies, there's going to be an inheritance tax bill. And how is that going to be funded? My suspicion is that the only way you can fund that is by selling the farm. Having to sell the farm to pay the business who's going to buy the farm? Will it be a big conglomerate? No doubt we'll end up with a lot bigger farming industries, less independent, small-scale farmers. Is that a good thing? I don't think it's a good thing. I think we're going to hear about this forever and a day. I think it's going to be really one of the big talking points, other than national insurance. I think this is going to be the big talking point.
Yeah, I think even in the sort of 24 hours since, I think you're right, it seems to have been, I think as much as anything, it's the shock of it, isn't it? I think certainly the rural community and advisors to the rural sector have been surprised by the introduction of this. But it's from what people have been saying, it's that understanding that, a 200-acre farm with a farmhouse and outbuildings, it's at 10 to 12,000 pounds an acre. If you do the maths, put the house in and stuff, you're £2.5 million. So I think your point is extremely valid, that at some point you have to find the money to pay the taxman, and it's going to be a six-figure sum. So
yeah, but £2.5 million, it makes them sound as if they're rich. Well, they might be asset rich, but they are generally cash poor, generally struggling. So there isn't going to be £100,000 or £200,000 sat in a bank account on the whole, ready to pay an inheritance tax bill.
No, and I think it comes with a health warning, doesn't it? That really for farmers and farming families, reach out to your professional advisors, talk to our rural team at Bruton Knowles, who work hand in hand with tax and legal advisors to work with families to come up with the best scenario for them. So yeah, please get in touch.
I mean, whether this will play out this way or not, but I think if I was an elderly farmer and I was thinking of putting my land forward, or some of my land forward, for promotion for housing, I might think about the consequences of doing it, bearing in mind that if that promotion moves the land on through the planning process, its value will increase. I then unfortunately die. The inheritance tax has just got bigger, but there's still no money to pay for it because the planning permission hasn't come through and the land hasn't been bought. So is that going to be a drag on land supply? The last thing the government want when they're trying to deliver 1.5 million houses over the next 5 years.
Yeah, it's unintended consequences, isn't it?
The problem is that at the moment, because we've got this almost a shock impact, that everybody will just stop and take stock of what's happening and try to get advice and understand what's occurring. So probably for at least the next 6 months, nobody's going to do anything if you've got an agricultural holding. You'll just go off and see your advisors. And I suspect advisors will start to work through other options to protect the tax position of their clients. And as James said, land agents have a part to play in that. But it's not a simple matter, I don't think, of people saying we can avoid this or we can't avoid it. But certainly I think for the next few months, people will just say, well, let's have a look at this. We'll not sign this document, we'll not sign the option, we won't progress this until we understand the full implications. And I think that's one of the issues more generally in the budget, is until people have absorbed this massive impact, £40 billion to be taken from effectively small businesses, then people won't progress with anything. They'll just work out what's the best for them and then progress with things potentially or not, as you say, Guy. I think the other thing about agricultural holdings is that people see this in the long term. It's multi-generational. Yeah. People don't farm for now, they farm for their sons and their grandsons or their daughters and granddaughters. And the problem is that in that sense, it's quite easy to sit there and say, well, actually, capital gains has gone up, we've got this IHT issue, we'll just leave it. We'll see what happens in 5 years, we'll see what happens in 10 years, there'll be changes. And if a government that's more favourable to the agricultural community comes in, then we might do something. And I think that's the other issues, that perhaps for the next 5 years, or until there's a different government with a different view of how to tax agricultural land, then people just won't do anything, because actually it is multi-generational.
Yeah, and it plays into what Guy was hinting at, that ultimately that decision-making process slows down, and the time lag of sites coming to the market slows down because people are just taking an awful lot longer to make decisions. And as Nigel said, if it's a generational thing, which, as we know in farming, it tends to be with farming families, people will just take a lot longer and just play a waiting game, which is fine, but the whole government ethos and pushes around, delivering in excess of 300,000 houses, new build houses a year. A lot of that is built on farmland.
And I think it's a general point with this budget. What there isn't, as far as I can see, is anything that helps people to progress. There aren't any tax breaks that say, if you do this, which is what we want as a government, i.e. to build 1.5 million houses, there aren't any tax breaks to encourage people to do that. it's all sort of pulled back to the government and sits with the government to deliver through their various agencies. It's the same with other things. As Ian mentioned earlier, there aren't any real tax breaks for the leisure industry. There's continuation, but a big reduction of the rateable value issue. Other things such as, and again, everything's not in isolation in terms of the budget, but we've also got the increase in minimum wage. So if you're running a leisure business, your rates are still going to be high. You've got an issue of paying your staff and also the normal things that are around in terms of purchasing your products, etc. And the energy costs are also huge. And that seems to be something that wasn't addressed really in the budget.
I think you're right. I think you need to take professional advice and take stock. If the average farm is 200 acres, then you can immediately be expected to hit with a very high inheritance tax bill. But take the right professional advice to make sure you do the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's right, Ian. I think shock factor aside, I think it's the fact that in terms of that threshold figure, it's going to capture an awful lot of family farms. So a standout from this budget was Labour's ongoing commitment to green and sustainable energy development and the commitment to making the UK the world's leading green superpower. So what does that encompass? Launching GB Energy, renewable energy projects, £2 billion worth of investment in carbon capture, hydrogen and renewables. These are all a significant focus. So what are our thoughts in terms of this particular budget and the changing face of Britain and its energy usage? What do you think, Nigel?
I think it's part of the ongoing process that the government have clearly seen this as a high priority to progress and get to their aspiration of the green energy superpower, which they discussed as part of their manifesto. As you mentioned, James, there is the GB Energy, which I understand will be located up in Aberdeen, and that'll be progressing. I think there's about 8 billion committed to that, which I think will be a catalyst for progressing with lots and lots of schemes across the country. But in terms of the budget, I think they're focusing on carbon capture, which is a mechanism for taking carbon out of the air and putting it somewhere safe to store that, possibly in the North Sea or other mining areas, etc. But also hydrogen, which I think is the almost the Cinderella of the renewables world. Obviously water is hydrogen and oxygen, and if you can take renewable energy to break those down, you can produce hydrogen. It can be used in various different uses, such as power generation and also cars, etc. And one area that I understand could be quite interesting is in shipping, which is currently quite high on the world's carbon footprint. If it moves to hydrogen, that will be better. So I think it's almost a part of that ongoing progression in this budget, I think, rather than anything astounding.
Yeah, well, I think this presents an opportunity for investment and growth in the UK and is needed to keep us on track with our decarbonisation commitments. You mentioned carbon capture, Nigel, and the infrastructure and clean energy pledges include 8 billion for carbon capture and 11 green hydrogen projects. The support for 4 new hydrogen projects across Scotland and Wales and 200 million for electric vehicle charging infrastructure support for port infrastructure and to facilitate floating offshore wind. Yeah,
I think they've set out a lot of commitments, haven't they? And in reality, it's going to be a combination of things to deliver that. Enough power to sort of keep UK PLC going. Also commitments around sort of EV infrastructure and low carbon transport. Again, it's early days. As we know, the infrastructure is patchy at best across the UK. So government needs to continue to work for long-term sustainable commitments there in terms of cash as much as anything, as well as planning, which can often be an issue with these things. There's also something in there, Guy, around sustainable housing commitments, green building, sustainability.
Yeah, and that's what took my interest, really. There's been an announcement of about 3.4 billion additional funding for domestic energy efficiency improvement, and this is part of the Warm Homes plan that was within their manifesto. It's basically, there's 2 real main focuses. There's about 1.8 billion to support fuel poverty schemes, and that is there to help households reduce their energy bills. I think they're estimating 225,000 households might reduce their bills by over £200, so that'll obviously be welcome.
Thanks everyone for your views. I think what we'll do is we'll just have a quick roundup and a simple takeaway of what do we really get from this budget, and what are our views in terms of the future in the UK.
I think it was announced as being a budget for growth, and I find it difficult to see how it's going to lead to growth of any substantial nature. I think from a property point of view, the impact on inheritance tax and capital gains tax will probably mean that people just hold off and think about what that impacts on their particular property scheme, their particular development, etc. And I think in terms of the green energy agenda, it helps to keep things moving forward, but there's nothing of any great consequence in the budget that will move us forward.
Markets broadly reacted positively, really because many of the announcements were highly anticipated. So the build-up to Wednesday was focus how the government can balance infrastructure investments with increased borrowings without compromising fiscal stability, and there was no massive surprises there.
No, I think for me, my main takeaway is probably that it's generally positive news for the house building industry. Lots of proposals to try and increase supply, particularly of affordable housing. There's funding for 300 more planning officers, for example, which was confirmed. There's some good news on housing, both in the manifesto and in the budget. If they can pull it off, then it bodes well for the future. But I think my other takeaway is that there need to be some really tangible improvements in public services and the economy in order for people to accept the pain that goes with a £40 billion tax rate. That is what they're going to be judged against.
I think that's right. I think I'd echo what all three of you have said. It's a very large tax take, and people need to see the tangible, the difference or the benefits that come from that. I think the difficulty for government is some of these initiatives are going to take an awful long time to impact us. I think when we look at the sort of, the green energy superpower, I think it's a great aspiration. I just think knowing the infrastructure sector as we do, it's very, very difficult, it's very expensive, and it takes a long time to get infrastructure projects delivered through the planning cycle and out the other side. You can see some of these initiatives not really bearing fruit for the next 5, 10, 15 years. So good that the commitments are there, good that it's the starting point with a lot of these things, but I just think it's going to be a longer journey than perhaps some people think. And I would just conclude by saying that the economic landscape for individuals and businesses has been very poor for the last 4 or 5 years. So in that context, I agree with Nigel. I don't think it's a budget that helps UK growth in any way. And when you look at the projections for growth within the economy, they're frightening, really. There just isn't enough growth, which begs the question, if we don't get growth into our economy, how are we going to pay for these things over time? As Ian said, borrowings just keep going up and up. We've just got to be really careful that we don't live beyond our means as a country. Well, that's wrapped up today's episode of Landmark. I hope our discussion on the autumn budget has provided you with some interesting insights and a clearer perspective on the opportunities and challenges we're looking at as we move towards 2025. A big thank you to our guests for sharing their expertise and breaking down what these budget changes mean for us in our sector. It's evident that while there are hurdles ahead, there are also great opportunities for those who can adapt strategically and focus on sustainable, value-driven projects. If you're interested in learning more about how Bruton Knowles can support your business with insights, consultancy, or direct support in navigating this shifting landscape, don't hesitate to reach out. Visit our website or connect with our team directly. We're here to help you make the most of the emerging opportunities. Thank you once again for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to Landmark on your favourite podcast platform so don't miss any episodes. We'll be back soon with more industry insights and updates on the ever-evolving property sector. Until then, I'm James Bailey and this is Landmark. Take care and we'll see you next time.